Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for a fascinating discussion about cults and coercive control. I'm delighted to have Emmy-nominated television showrunner, director, writer, and producer Cecilia Peck join me tonight to discuss how she got the idea to make the hit Starz docu-series Seduced inside the Nxivm Cult, which was released in fall 2020, and what the journey was like to get it written, produced, and streamed. And I'm also thrilled to have Hoyt Richards join us to share the story of his double life as the world's first supermodel, while he was also a member of the Eternal Values cult. And we'll learn why it's so important to both of them to raise awareness about cults and coercive control. This topic is in some ways very appropriate today because it's Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we're reminded of the coercive control that Adolf Hitler had on many, and the devastation, death, and destruction that resulted. So we're going to discuss tonight how cults attract their victims, learn about how they keep them involved, the complicated and difficult process it is to intervene to free someone of a cultic relation. And we're also going to have the opportunity to watch Cecilia's film, Seduced inside the Nxivm Cult, which got 100 on Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty astounding. So we're very excited about that. And we're also thankful tonight for the Princeton Club, who's sponsoring this program, and our co-sponsors, Princeton Arts Alumni, the Princeton Club of Southern California, and Princeton in Hollywood. So it's an honor to introduce our guests, Cecilia Peck and Hoyt Richards. Emmy-nominated filmmaker Cecilia Peck directed and produced the new Starz docu-series Seduced inside the Nxivm Cult, as well as the Netflix original feature documentary Brave New World and the feature documentary Shut Up and Sing. She produced A Conversation with Gregory Peck about her actor father, and she speaks globally about race awareness, rape awareness, and prevention, as well as overcoming trauma. She's a member of the documentary branch of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and she serves on the board of the San Diego International Film Festival. Her film Seduced is currently nominated for an ACE Editing Award, and the series is eligible for multiple Emmy Awards. Hoyt Richards is an award-winning actor, writer, filmmaker, and a cult survivor advocate. In his early career, Hoyt worked as a fashion model and is considered the world's first male supermodel. And we'll have a chance to see some of the photos of him in action in a little while. In 2000, Hoyt moved from New York to Los Angeles, where he began working as an actor, writer, director, and producer. In addition to his entertainment career, Hoyt speaks publicly about the dangers and lessons learned from his experience of cultic and abusive environments. He also assists families and individuals who have loved ones caught in cultic situations. And I'm Wendy Gerber, CEO of the International Consulting Group, a global strategy, branding, and marketing firm helping leading global corporations achieve business growth with a triple bottom line approach. I've led marketing, communications, corporate strategy, and sustainability for corporations, including Ralph Lauren, who you'll see Hoyt has also modeled for, so we shared that, Kenneth Cole, as well as Citigroup. So tonight, Cecilia and Hoyt will speak with me for about an hour. We'll be showing 5 clips, and then they'll answer questions from the audience for about 15 to 20 minutes. So please remember to click on the Q&A tab and type your questions into the box, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So now let's talk a little bit about background. Cecilia, before we start talking about your series Seduce, I think our audience would be really interested in your incredible background. You come from a renowned Hollywood family, the daughter of Gregory and Veronique Peck. Did you know when you were at Princeton that you wanted to go into the entertainment industry?
Okay, well, thank you, Wendy, for arranging this, and welcome to our listeners. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was an English major at Princeton, and I thought I would go into either journalism or publishing, but I had done some theater at Princeton. So when I graduated and moved to New York, I had enrolled in some acting classes while I was working, and I ended up doing a play through the acting school, and a casting director saw me in the play, and I got an agent, and I started to work as an actor for the next 10 years in film and TV. But I was always wanting to be behind the camera too, and shooting videos and cutting them together. And then um, when I was in my early mid 30s, I was offered an opportunity to become the assistant to one of our great documentary filmmakers, Barbara Koppel, who was shooting a film in France and needed an assistant who spoke French. So that was my introduction to working in documentary. I went to work for her company after that and learned documentary filmmaking from her.
That's terrific. What it's wonderful how serendipitous life can be and present all these great opportunities. So Hoyt, what was your connection to Nxivm and Cecilia and the Seduced docu-series?
Well, because as you mentioned earlier, I'm quite active in the cult survivor kind of network. We're constantly always talking about groups coming up, and I heard about the Nxivm group long before it was mainstream media, and through that, a friend of mine, this guy Steve Hassan, who's considered a cult expert, had put me in touch with actually Sarah and Nippy, who were featured on The Vow, which is another show that was on HBO that dealt with the same subject. And so I knew about it, and I was aware, and I was actually at a cult conference. It's called the ICSA conference, the International Cultic Studies Association, out in Manchester. And Cecilia was there shooting for her project. And we had mutual friends. I'd heard of Cecilia. And so it was kind of nice to connect. And then while I was there, she said, it'd be great if you would, talk to the girls, because you've had this journey that you've had, and maybe you could speak with some of them. They're just coming out of this situation. And so I sat down with the girls that they were with and tried to give them some heads up of what that recovery process is going to look like. Because as we'll talk about later, the aftermath is actually much harder than being in the cult even, which sounds counterintuitive, but it takes a lot to kind of work your way through the experience. And that's where Cecilia and I met.
Well, one of the things you shared with me, Hoyt, that I found really interesting was that those lured into cults are not gullible figures, which people sometimes mistakenly think they are. And you're certainly an example of a powerful, successful man. So we're going to give our audience a view of this. Let's show a few photos to set the stage. You can see Hoyt as a football player at Princeton, as a Ralph Lauren model, in an ad for Valentino. And Hoyt was Cindy Crawford for a Versace campaign that was shot by Richard Avedon. So pretty incredible shots showing a life that was really in the spotlight. And yet at the same time, you were part of a cult. So can you talk a little bit about your background and how you led this double life as a supermodel and a cult member?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there as far as how this happens, who it happens to, that sort of thing. And I certainly would have put myself in that category. I think there's this prevalent attitude that it happens to somebody else. It would never happen to me. And the truth is that's not accurate, because there's really no profile of the type of person this happens to, because it truly can happen to anybody. And I really try to describe it to people that it's a perfect storm of sorts. Basically, you have to be at a point in your life where you're kind of seeking maybe some answers to some questions, whether it's why am I here? What am I supposed to do with my life? What's the purpose? What kind of footprint am I going to leave behind? And when you're entering into that sort of phase of life, usually most people are very encouraging. Like, it's great that you're seeking things out, and go out and try to find some answers. But no one really warns you that that is a potentially very dangerous time, in the sense that you're very vulnerable to people who could be potentially manipulating you because they recognize that you're receptive to looking for answers. And if you cross paths with someone who, from your perception, is providing those sort of answers, you tend to think this is something wonderful that's happening, and you can be kind of taken down a rabbit hole of sorts. So I think I was an economics major. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I try to tell people, like, if you don't really have a game plan and you feel like you should, and then you meet someone who's really excited about their game plan, and it certainly sounds a lot better than your no plan, well, then you can find that to be very appealing. And that's literally how it began for me. I actually met my guru slash cult leader on the beach of Nantucket when I was 16. And you don't think Nantucket's a place you're going to meet a cult leader, but it's an interesting thing when you think that sitting on a towel one day at 16 is going to take your life in a whole nother way than you would have ever imagined. And I think one of the reasons I stuck in it as long as I did, and even when people considered it to maybe be a little bit culty and had the courage to even approach me with that word, my response was, "Are you kidding? I would never get involved with a cult. How could you ever think that?" And the main criteria I had that it couldn't be something dangerous or a cult was that I was in it. So I think as long as people think it can't happen to them, they're very vulnerable. And I try to really convey to people that it really, truly can happen to any of us.
So if we're going to shortly get into Cecilia's film, but I have one more question for you, Hoyt, before we do that. You were obviously an incredibly successful model, not a common career path for an economics major from Princeton to go into. And so I'd love to understand how that evolved. And also, while you were modeling, you were with the cult for 20 years and apparently invested around $4.5 million. So can you tell us a bit about this journey, first into modeling and then really getting engulfed by this cultic relationship?
Sure. And I think invested is probably not the correct word, probably donated. Investment means like you're not going to get something out of it. And
Right,
I was just giving it away. But yeah, the modeling thing came up. I did not ever have any aspiration to be a model. I was actually playing football, and I had problems with my shoulders. I was up in New York seeing a shoulder specialist, and this was actually where the cult leader, this guy Freddie von Mears, who I had met in Nantucket, he was living there, and he had kind of created this open door policy that if I ever came to New York, I could crash in his place, and he would invite me to Studio 54 with his friends. And so initially I thought I was actually taking advantage of him on some level. I was much younger. I had this contact in New York. He could get me and my friends into Studio 54. And he was the one who actually introduced me to Joe Hunter over at Ford. And that's how that thing kind of, took hold. And I actually started modeling during my junior and even senior year at Princeton, because I found out with my shoulders, I couldn't play football anymore. And so I made this pivot into modeling. I think it was kind of the only thing that would deal with my 20-year-old ego. Like I couldn't perform on the field. Maybe I could perform in some other kind of stage. And so it's one of those, decisions I just kind of made on a whim, and it worked out beyond my wildest dreams. And, I think it was just in the right place at the right time as far as how the career takes off. It was a time when a lot of more athletic guys were coming in. So it kind of this idea that the industry was kind of shifting, and it felt more receptive to someone like myself. It didn't feel like such a crazy pivot from Princeton, in the sense that I thought like, oh, I could do this for a couple of years and then I'll figure out what I want to do. And then it just kind of took hold and went off into a whole nother stratosphere, and I just kept riding the wave.
Well, that is a great setup to look at Cecilia's show's trailer. So let's take a look at Seduced inside the Nxivm Cult trailer, and I'll share with everybody in our audience. The series is on Starz, so you're going to get a bit of it now, but then you can go to Starz and watch the entire thing. Well, I had chills just watching the trailer, so you can imagine how compelling the entire series is, and we'll get a chance to look at a few of the clips tonight. So, Cecilia, you completed production in spring 2020 of this film, and post-production in October 20, just prior to the show's premiere on Starz. What most attracted you to the story? Did you have a personal connection to the Nxivm Cult? And I'd love to hear how you first got involved, and also what was it like to have to be doing production during COVID?
Okay, that's a lot. And before I tell you how it came about, I think want to say about Hoyt that when I was researching the subject, and the learning curve is very steep to try to understand cults and high control groups and how the indoctrination process works. But once you start to research, Hoyt is one of the people who pops up because he's such an eloquent and kind advocate for others who are leaving cults. And when I found out that there was someone who had gone to Princeton who had had this experience and had plenty of recovery and could help me put it in context, I was really excited to meet him. And then going to Manchester, England, as Hoyt mentioned, to a cult conference, I didn't know, what that would be like. It was such an unfamiliar word. So having Hoyt there to help make sense of this was incredible. And also, as he said, he was an incredible friend and advocate for the women who were recently out of Nxivm and nervous about coming forward, and meeting somebody like Hoyt who had had 20 years of recovery really helped them to feel safe about working with us. So that's a little bit about our background. And I found out about Nxivm because I had had an intern on a former documentary, a very smart university graduate who then I had lost touch with for a couple of years. And in 2014-15, I started to get emails from her saying, I'm in an incredible women's group and you've got to join. You're going to love it. It'll change your life. And these emails became very persistent. And I finally wrote and said, I'm not sure what you found. It sounds great, but I'm not looking for a group right now. But she didn't stop. And then she was trying to persuade me to come to Albany, New York, and meet her friend, the actress Allison Mack. And anyway, I never went to a meeting. And then a year after that, she called and said, I'm really sorry. I was in a cult and I didn't know it, and I was being forced to recruit you. So I said, okay, let's have coffee and talk. So that's how I found out about Nxivm. And she introduced me to the former members who did choose to come forward and tell their stories. She's not in the group, in the series, but that was my introduction to it. And I think the interest was really in studying the vulnerability of the human mind, and especially when we're approached with the kind of influence that's unethical, and just what happens to the mind. And India Oxenberg, when she joined, became, gave us the narrative through line for the series. She was 19 years old when she first went to this course that she thought was an executive success program. She wanted to start her own catering business and learn business skills. And that was the legitimate front of the Nxivm organization. And these workshops were held in beautiful homes. They were full of prominent, accomplished people, not only celebrities, but Sir Richard Branson had been in the program. There was a US Surgeon General. There were plenty of Ivy League graduates. I mean, this group did an incredible job of targeted recruitment and marketing to seem very legitimate. So these were some of the questions we wanted to ask, was how does an intelligent, accomplished person get drawn into a group like this?
And what was it like to have to do production during the pandemic?
Well, we had almost completed production, filming in March of 2020 when COVID hit. We did have a few more shoots. So we, I think we're among the first productions to try to establish COVID protocols, and which meant testing and having a COVID advisor on the set, and reducing the number of people on the set, shooting with a distance, setting up, sound and camera equipment remotely as much as possible. So we only had a few shoot days under COVID, and everybody who, not all of our crews were willing to come and work. The ones who did were, I'm so grateful to them. But then post-production was a challenge because we had to leave our production offices where, you could pop into everybody's editing room in the same hallway. And, these endeavors are, very communal. So we had to figure out how to work remotely and share cuts, and it delayed things. So, that was a transition. I mean, now that's how everybody's working, but it was a learning curve too.
And you shared with me that you really wanted to tell the story from India's perspective. So how did this shape the storyline, filming, etc.?
Well, we wanted to tell the story from the perspective of India and other young women who were former members of the cult. So definitely from the victim's perspective. And I make a lot of films about trauma, recovering from trauma, and also about women who are using their voices. But that was important to us, not to look at it from the point of view of the leadership of the cult, but really from the women who had been drawn into the cult. I think it wasn't easy for them to come forward. Nobody wants to admit that they've been in a high control group or a cult. So the women who appear on camera were incredibly brave. I mean, they were also worried about retaliation. This cult was very powerful. It was funded by the Bronfman sisters, the daughters of the Seagram's liquor empire. And they were able to really practice, legal threats and terrorism on anybody who tried to speak up or leave the cult. They funded a lot of legal harassment on members who tried to leave. So there were a lot of reasons people didn't necessarily want to come forward, but the ones who did believed that it was important to let people know what the red flags were, to make others feel that they weren't alone, and that people could learn a lot from their experiences.
So I'd love to get into the series now and share it with our audience. The first episode of Seduced covers India's introduction into the cult. Can you set up this clip for us and then we'll share it?
Well, I think this clip takes us into one of their first, intro presentations, which looked so legitimate and even glamorous. The thing that we won't see in the clip is that Catherine Oxenberg, the actress whose daughter India is the central character of Seduced, had been approached by a friend of hers, a very legitimate professional person who had recommended this program called Executive Success Programs as something that could really, help her and benefit her daughter. So that's often how it starts, is somebody you trust recommends a program to you. And then I think this clip takes up pretty much from there.
So powerful, and not just the story of India, but as a mother, I can't even imagine how devastating it would be to actually be the introduction for your daughter into a cult like this. Cecilia, can you talk a bit about the appeal of Nxivm and how the group was able to attract these educated, professional people like India and her mother, and also the role of coercion, and how Keith used the Nxivm curriculum to entice so many people to join and then to stay in Nxivm?
Well, as I said, it was called, the public front was called Executive Success Programs. So this seemed like a legitimate organization, and I don't think it's unusual for people to take a course in communication skills or business skills or personal development. And the cult would slowly identify people who would be lured to Albany with the promise of promotion within the organization. It was run like an MLM. They set up a system of promotions where if you achieved a certain rank, you could begin to make money by working as a coach. So people were incentivized to rise up in the organization. And one of the ways you could do that was by recruiting others. So all of a sudden it's operating like a pyramid scheme where in order to move up, you're bringing other people in. And for a long time, you wouldn't see anything that was unethical. And our series really looks at that very gradual process of indoctrination that causes you to break down your ability to think critically and begin to do things that aren't in your best interest.
And one of the things that it seems was so critical in making this film was really building a bond and trust with India and the other subjects that made them willing to open up. I know you had a group working on the film that was largely women. We'll show a photo of that. Can you speak about how you built this bond and was part of the reason that you had a number of women working on the series to make India and others more comfortable?
Well, we did have women as heads of every key department on the series, from our network execs at Starz to myself and my filmmaking partner and co-showrunner Inbal Lesner, to our DPs and camera operators and sound recordists. Like you saw, we often had all women on the set, and also on the production team. We had women editors. We had nice men with us too, but we had as many women as possible because we wanted it to be a story told by women, about women and for women, but also we did need to create a safe environment on the set, because when you're asking trauma survivors to recall difficult things, they need to feel supported. And we trained everybody on the set on how to talk to trauma survivors and to give people time to recover after an interview, not to break and move to the next setup right away. So we made sure that everybody we hired had sensitivity, and we also raised funds to provide therapy for everybody who came on camera before, during, and after shooting. We still provide therapy for all of the women who appear in Seduced, and our network Starz contributed to that fund. So we really tried to create a new playbook for how to ethically make a documentary with trauma survivors.
That's incredible that you provided the therapy and continue to do so. That's really tremendous. And Hoyt, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Comparing to what we just saw, why were you attracted to the Eternal Values Cult? And can you talk about how you were recruited and what the similarities in the recruiting process were, if any, to what Nxivm did?
Sure. And but first, I'd like to acknowledge what Cecilia and her team did was so groundbreaking. I mean, I've been very interested in this subject matter, obviously, for my recovery period of 2 decades now. And a lot of the way this subject matter is dealt with in the media and in certainly documentaries or film is really, the only way I can describe it is poor storytelling. They usually focus on the cult leader, which is, from a storytelling point of view, the antagonist. And that's the person who's also the sociopath, which is not a very relatable character to put in the front. And what Cecilia did, with her storytelling was to really focus on the people that were there, the so-called victims who become survivors. But that's, if you want to really understand what it is like interfacing with a cult leader, talk to the people who dealt with them. And that's been something that's always been missing in the way the stories have been told, because there's such fascination with the person at the top and all the carnage they create and all the lives they've ruined. But the truth is, the stories that are most relevant and most important are the ones that actually got through it, survived, and are now trying to make sense of it and move on with their lives. So I think, that it's really a groundbreaking thing, and it's by far the best, work I've seen in the field, and I'm just thrilled that it's out there. And I think it's just a great teaching tool that anyone wants to know about the subject matter. It's a great place to look. And they touch on a lot of the things that cults do to indoctrinate and seduce you, in the sense that, there is, all cults are appealing because a lot of the material they offer is legitimate. You know, and a lot of times it can be whether it's a religious text like the Bible or the Quran, or you know, for us it was the Hindu Vedas. I mean, legitimate spiritual texts. So these can be very inspirational, and you can find a lot of justification in being, you know, really enthralled by them. But it's also tied to behavior of this kind of what's called love bombing, where you're kind of being told everything you never were probably told enough by your parents, which would have been humanly possible, but like how special you are, how unique you are, what untapped potential you have. And this is one of these things that no one warns you that feeling good too fast can be very dangerous. It's the same sort of thing that happens in unhealthy romances that develop. Like when you meet someone and they seem to say all the right things and they just sweep you off your feet, and you think you can understand why every movie's been made about love, or every love song on the radio makes sense now. Like all of that kind of gets you so excited, and you don't realize that that is actually a seduction process. And you know, I think what's really important, you know, to recognize is this. It's very much kind of what you saw in the video. It's a bait and switch. You kind of, I will never beat myself up for what I signed up for. You know, I was basically being pitched that this would be an opportunity to become more self-realized, become less selfish, be able to help my fellow man, help the planet on some level. I mean, very noble attributes that I feel, you know, proud that I actually stood up and said, okay, I want to try to do that. And the caveat was, you were going to have to spend this lifetime not pursuing your personal hopes, dreams, and ambitions. You're going to kind of sacrifice your life for this cause. And that, you know, I don't know if everyone would do that, but that was something that I don't knock myself down for trying. Now, of course, my journey was to discover what I signed up for and what it actually was were vastly different. And it only took me about 20 years to figure that out, but I did, luckily. And I think that's really the journey of the so-called victim is you don't sign up. It's like the rape victim. You don't ask to be raped, you know? And I think it's very easy for people to try to feel safe to say, well, what was wrong with you? Were you weak? Or and it's really nothing. Those factors really don't matter. Cults are actually looking for leadership type people because they bring in more people. You know, my role, unbeknownst to myself, became that of a recruiter because, you know, it's the same way like Tom Cruise works in Scientology. You become a poster child, so hopefully to bring more other, you know, more other people. And so it's this type of thing that you know, that you just kind of get involved, you know, because it just feels so right. I mean, I remember Freddie saying to me early on, just like things like, oh, you're not like your friends, and they don't understand you like I do. And everyone wants to hear that. I mean, you know, we all feel like someone sees us or hears us in the right way. And those are very effective coercive techniques to think that this person really wants to help you and is looking out for your best interests, but it's just a way to get you to buy in. And then peer pressure starts taking over. And well, I can go on forever, but you know, it's basically, it's this type of thing of where, you know, it's, you know, you always feel as if this opportunity is so great that if you don't take it seriously, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. And that's kind of where the hook goes in. So just under the premise that, well, let me check it out, is where you start to go down the rabbit hole.
Well, that was really very compellingly said. And I love the fact that you've really shared with us that it's not just these sort of institutionalized cults. These cultic relationships happen in one-on-one relationships as well. And you really talked about this cycle of things starting out looking really wonderful, and then they become disturbing, but you're kind of immunized to it in a way. And that's really what this next clip is about, because Cecilia chose some really disturbing experiments that are performed on cult members. Can you set up this clip for us, please?
So this is, India has gone to visit another cult author and expert named Rick Allen Ross. And really the whole spine of our series is India, who went into Nxivm at 19 and stayed for 7 years. We met her about 1.5 years later, but she was trying to understand what had happened to her brain. she really wanted to make sense of how this could have happened to her. So in this scene, she goes to visit a cult expert and is describing to him some horrific experiments that were performed on the Nxivm members.
Wow.
Incredible. So the role of science and pseudoscience in these control groups, Cecilia, why would the Nxivm members accept having their brains scanned wearing these caps with electrodes attached while they were subjected to this violent imagery? What was the purpose of this?
So Nxivm tried to distinguish themselves from other groups that were religious or mystical or self-help by saying they were science-based. So they had all the scientific terminology, and they convinced people that they were able to track the effects of their coursework, which they called their technology, on people's brainwaves. So it was part of their indoctrination technique and their marketing to make themselves appear legitimate. But what they were really doing was performing unsanctioned medical experiments. And I think they were looking to both numb people and to determine who was susceptible or who would accept being shown scenes of violence. And, then there was a lot of abuse, visited on the cult members, and particularly the women who eventually joined the inner circle, which was called a sorority, but was actually a slave master group within Nxivm. It was called DOS.
And you had a lot of different cult experts throughout the series. Can you comment a bit about the interplay between their analysis and what the cult members thought was happening?
So I think the dramatic tension in the show really comes from the difference between what the members thought they were experiencing, which they thought they were, gaining strength of character if they were subjected to physical punishments, push-ups in the snow, calorie restriction, sleep restriction. They believed it was making them stronger, teaching them how to overcome obstacles, preparing them for the difficulties of life. But the cult experts provide the perspective on how that indoctrination, gradual breaking down of people's critical thinking was actually working. So that's how we use them.
I want to make sure that at the end we have time to talk about recovery. So let's move into the next clip. This really gives us some insights into how Nxivm guaranteed loyalty from members. Can you set up the clip for us?
Well, Nxivm used something that they called collateral, which was compromising material that they asked from cult members to turn over, which could be explicit photographs or private information about family members, things that if they were released or revealed could damage their relationships or their lives irreparably. And they were told that this was done to teach them to guarantee their word. So if they had committed to a number of classes or to a number of calorie restriction, they were asked to collateralize their word so that they wouldn't break it. And women were told that they weren't accountable to their word. So this material actually was blackmail, which was held over their heads if they tried to leave or if they questioned anything. So this clip has to do with this collateral material that Nxivm was collecting.
It's so heart-wrenching to watch, Cecilia, but that's the power of what you've done with this series. It's incredible. So what does it take to deprogram from a cult and to forgive yourself?
I mean, there's so much to unpack there. And, you know, we hadn't talked prior to that clip about the branding. You know, India was part of this inner circle within Nxivm of women who were branded with the cult leader's initials. And prior to that, she had been sexually abused by the cult leader. So the, you know, the series is about how you can get to that point. And this scene of her in the neuromuscular therapy is there to offer to others that you have to seek therapy in whatever form works for you. Nxivm had abused talk therapy. They had used it to extract confessions and secrets that were then used against the members. So that's not India's preferred form of therapy. Hers is body work and releasing a lot of the stored trauma. So, you know, that's part of the healing process is finding out what works for you. But also for these women, activism was a big part of their healing. They have all begun to speak out about their experiences, and it really helps them to know that they are turning their trauma into activism, and that there is post-traumatic growth that can come from speaking up. And also several of them are advocating for legislation against coercive control. That's another piece that we can go into further, but the healing process, and Hoyt can talk about this too, certainly doesn't end when you leave the cult. You know, it's definitely lifelong, because so many things are triggering, and who was that person, and why did you accept the things you did? And often the victims of cult are forced to become victimizers. I mean, India was forced to recruit others, and even into DOS, into the slave master society. So she's still dealing with the guilt from that. So those are some of the issues around healing from being in a high control group.
And Hoyt, this must evoke a lot of emotions in you. Can you share with us how hard it was for you to leave the cult? I think your brother tried an intervention at one point to get you to leave. How did you ultimately leave, and why?
Well, that's a whole long story to unpack. Basically, that people always wonder, what was the moment? Like, did I wake up one morning and go, oh my God, I think this could be dangerous. Maybe it's a cult. Maybe I should get the hell out of here. Like, it wasn't like that at all remotely. Basically, things had gotten so bad that I, at this point, they were shaving my head, so I couldn't model anymore. I was quarantined to our headquarters down in North Carolina. I was had to be the first one up, the last one to bed. I had to do every type of slave-like labor to teach me humility, and I was going about my chores without the best attitude. So I would face a verbal firing squad. We used to call it the hot seat, where you literally, whoever was around, you would literally put one person there, and I would be that person, and they would verbally assault me for anywhere from 2 hours, sometimes to 10 or 12 hours, about how I had been resistant and resentful to doing my chores, which were to help the group. And I was a bit resentful and resistant, because I'm looking in the mirror, I look like a convict. I'm thinking to myself, I could be in Paris with Cindy Crawford or Claudia Schiffer, probably kissing her and making 25 grand a day. I guess I'm not spiritual, because I'd rather be there. And I was really deeply in conflict. So they would come at me and try to get me to come clean about all these things. And when you're under that high stress environment, you literally go catatonic. And so I think one of the worst things about the way these cultic groups operate, they're so abusive, and yet they've convinced you that the abuse is part of the training. So you keep trying to gut out this thing, thinking, I just got to get tougher, I got to get, and this is all for my benefit, not recognizing it's just flat out abuse. So ultimately, my break point was recognizing that they were never going to give up, because this went on for about, I'm not exaggerating, about 9 weeks every night. I'd face that verbal firing squad. I realized that they were not going to stop. They were the true seekers. They were the ones that were going to carry on. And I was actually feeling like I was hopeless. I was broken. I was unfixable. And the least I could do is relieve them of my dead weight so they could spend their time doing something much more constructive than dealing with a loser like me. And that was my mentality of why, which is kind of, in retrospect, that human spirit finding some convoluted way to get you out the door. Like as convoluted as it was, that was the motivation to get me the hell out. And I actually, it took me 3 attempts to escape successfully. They caught me a couple of times. But the thing I tell people, and I said it earlier, even though life in the cult is pretty awful, and I would say just downright terrible, the aftermath is so much more challenging because it took me a year and a half, almost 2 years to even admit to myself maybe what it was. Like I went into PTSD of just so convinced that I was evil. I turned my back on this group, turned my back on God. I was just this absolute piece of shit. And I kept thinking I'm gonna get struck down by lightning or hit by a truck, like I deserve it all. And they say it takes at least 12 to 24 months to be out of the actual active abusive environment for you to even consider the idea that maybe it's not just you, maybe the environment you're in has something to do with how awful you feel. And it was around that time that I started to consider that. And that's when I started to open my mind to the possibility that maybe people have been saying it was a cult. I knew nothing about cults. I'd had this attitude, it can't be a cult because I'm in it. And that, of course, was completely ignorant. And so I started to find out that it was. And then the real challenge becomes when you finally swallow that pill and say, because I actually got this book by this guy, Steve Hassan, and he had been in the Moonies. I remember my attitude being like, oh, well, I mean, he was in the Moonies. You'd have to, who joined something like that? Like, who, come on. And so I had this kind of prejudice against even the person who wrote the book, but the first 80 pages was how he had been indoctrinated and you could have just changed the words. And that was my wake up call. Like, oh my God, not only have I been in a cult, but I've been in a textbook cult. Like, I thought my situation was so special and so unique, I couldn't talk to anyone about it. And I'm just reading in this book that I am a textbook cult member. And that was obviously a really heart-sinking moment, but it was also the beginning of the recovery process. And that's where, the biggest pill you have to swallow is that one that you have to admit to yourself, this is where the rubber meets the road, that you got conned, that you got taken, whether you were influenced or not. And that's where people struggle because their pride or hubris gets in the way and they just can't admit that that happened. Because you have to go back, as I did, to 16 on that beach when I met that guy and start to reframe my whole life, which is now 30 years going forward, and try to make sense of it. And that is such a terrible challenge that most people will resist it like crazy. But that is the work. And you have to realize that there are things about it that were great and there are things about it that are awful. And that's the stuff you got to unpack. And you've got all your family and friends who are looking at you sideways like, dude, what the hell happened? And that's really hard. I had to become better at communication to try to foster the conversation so that healing could take place, because I recognized how they had gotten hurt. Like there's this ripple effect. It's like having a drug addict in the family. I didn't see my parents for 12 years. So you step out of everyone's lives, they're seeing you do something quite self-destructive and they feel powerless to stop you. They get wounded. And then when you come out and you're kind of finally talking and they're like, oh, you okay now? And I can see that they're wounded and yet I can't do that healing for them. And I have to live with the fact that a lot of these people who I love and care about and who cared about me got wounded, and yet that healing still hasn't happened. And I try to be a resource and try to foster those conversations, but I can't make it happen. So that whole challenge of the recovery process and trauma just doesn't go away. Trauma you learn to manage, and it can become something that is very empowering. And that's really where I treat it now. It's kind of like what Brene Brown talks about, your greatest cure to shame is vulnerability. And for me, it's just been owning that story, talking about it, being transparent and saying, yeah, this happened to me. It doesn't have to define my life, but it is part of my life. And it's actually informed my life in such a way that it's given me a lens looking at the world where I now look at the whole world differently. And with things that are going on, like I get it now, like whether it's politics or the military or advertising, I see cultic things going on all over the place. And, it's kind of like saying, I went to the school of hard knocks. I don't recommend anybody taking the courses I took, but it's taught me some pretty valuable life lessons, but it's not an easy journey. I'll put it that way.
Well, thank you for being so candid about that. And We have one more clip to share. We're going to run a few minutes over on the discussion part because I think our audience will share the view that this is such a powerful subject and so important to really shine a light on cultic relationships and advocacy and about the subject. So Cecilia, if you could set up the last clip for us, that would be great.
Well, as you saw, there was a trial, and I don't think this is a spoiler because it's been in the news, but while Seduced was airing, the cult leader, Keith Raniere, was sentenced to 120 years in prison. But this clip is kind of our homage to The Godfather and has to do with the arrests of his inner circle of enablers who helped him to run the cult.
Well, I'm glad that they finally got what was coming to them, and it's a very powerful last clip to share with our audience. Cecilia, you mentioned that there's legislation going on in some of the states. What are you looking to achieve? What's in place now, both on a state level and federal level, and also internationally?
Well, there are laws in other countries against coercive control, and there are several bills making their way through the legal system now in this country. We have legislation against elder abuse, and that's the kind of language that's being looked at to apply to coercive relationships when someone in a position of power has a coercive influence over someone else, whether it's through threats or punishment or physical harm, from one-on-one relationships all the way to workplace environments and cultic groups. So this, the Nxivm decision was very groundbreaking. I mean, they didn't prosecute him on the basis of coercive control because we don't have the laws yet, but he was tried on RICO and conspiracy and sex trafficking. But it's time for much stronger legislation to protect against this.
And I know both of your focus now is on raising awareness about cults and high control groups and helping people recover. So I'd love it if you would each tell us how you're promoting this activism. I also want to tell the audience after this question, we'll be going to your questions. So please do click on the Q&A tab and input your questions, and then your turn will be next.
Well, we started a website for the documentary. It's seduceddocumentary.com, and it offers resources for people who are trying to leave cults or families who are attempting to get their loved ones out. And I think for anybody who knows somebody who's in a group like this or suspect that they're in a coercive relationship, there are plenty of good books and resources. Dr. Yanya Lalich, Stephen Hassan, Rachel Bernstein, Hoyt is an amazing research, and just to be more aware of the red flags. If you're being asked to pay a lot of money repeatedly to a group where the results aren't really quantifiable, and what Hoyt talked about, that love bombing, something for our children to be aware of is any group or environment where they're overly praised or welcomed, that can be a danger sign. And anytime there's a presence of a charismatic leader who asks others to conform to his ideology, and also where information is restricted and where there is predatory alienation, where you're separated quickly from your family or friends so you don't have the perspective of critical thinking from people who love you. Those are some of the warning signs to look out for.
So, and Hoyt, I'd love for you to share your role in activism. Clearly, you're very involved.
Well, actually, one of the things that Cecilia and I even talked about is trying to even talk to like our university about possibly creating a course that would teach people about this, the subject matter. So you have some kind of tools in the toolbox going out into the world, knowing what's out there and how it works. I think that you could even put that in high schools. So that's one of the things, long-term ambitions I have. I've got different, being in the entertainment business, I've got different projects. I have a TV series where I'm hoping to be able to interview other cult survivors. I want to start putting faces and personalities onto these stories like the ones I have, for the people that have the courage to talk, so you can see it is someone like your neighbor or your brother or your dad that gets in these things, and that you can come through it and you can learn from it, and you can, there are silver linings of this sort of thing. And you know, the key is always talking about it. If it never gets talked about, then no healing happens. And like in my group in particular, we were never more than maybe 100 people, but there's less than 5 of us that can admit what it was and talk about it. So that means 95 of them are still traumatized in some form of fashion, whether denial or delusion. And that's, to me, the most tragic side of it all. You know, so I stay very active in the cult survivor community, kind of just try to build the same nomenclature so that we realize that we're all kind of experiencing the same thing, because the cultic relationship, like I talked about earlier, is part of the human condition. It's usually a one-on-one relationship where the person that you're, you know, seeking love and approval from is in some way controlling and abusing you. And we've all had that relationship where that person, no matter how we got in it, you know, it seems like no matter what we do, it's never enough, or whatever we do, we're somehow wrong. And yet we're trying so hard to please them. And the cult is that, adding in the group peer pressure element, and then the stakes are just much higher. Like in our group, we thought the end of the world was coming. So everything's just kind of dialed up on steroids. Like the fate of the world lies in balance if you're, you know, not able to do what that group is asking you to do. So this type of information, I think, is so useful, because ultimately we've all been wounded. We've all gotten these traumatic experiences, these unhealthy relationships, but because we haven't been diagnosing them correctly, the healing hasn't been happening. So until we all start speaking that same language, we won't really be able to foster the healing. So I think stories like mine, or the women from Nxivm, you know, coming forward, these are great teaching tools, because sometimes you need the extreme version to recognize the more subtle version in your own life. And that's kind of the space I'm trying to inhabit and, you know, inform.
And I have to share, Hoyt, that a lot of the comments in the Q&A are praising you for your courage in speaking out and really trying to make a difference on this. There's one question that will really resonate with you, I think. One person's Princeton roommate was also a football player and the classic all-American boy. He went to India one summer, attended a Maharishi session, and it altered his personality and life goals forever. He's still in that group. He's given a lot of money to the group, which concerns all of us. Any advice?
Yeah, boy, you know, the key with all of these things is to build bridges, not to confront someone, because when you're brainwashed, which I was, and probably in this case, this guy is, by confronting them, you push them away. So you have to enter from the point of view of trying to understand, trying to make sense of what they kind of got involved in and why, so that you can have a discussion, even to the point, I mean, basically the interventions I get involved with now are quite involved from the point of view that everyone's got to get educated on how this stuff works. And then you kind of, if you imagine the person being the center point, everyone who is trying to build a bridge with them is trying to apply some sort of pressure from any point of view to just put some sort of information in there that might re-trigger that critical thinking. It's kind of like when Horton hears the Who and you're hoping who can put the yop in that might get the brain to take back hold again, because it's literally like that. There was a kid we got out of Scientology where he was just so ingrained, but I was with him when he finally put it together. And when you start to reactivate that critical thinking, it's literally like a fog coming out of, you know, out in front of you, and you will pull yourself out. So you can't give up on anybody, because that's the power of the human spirit, but it's got to be done in a slow, gentle approach, and confronting them just makes people push you away. So the key is to try to get yourself educated and try to find some bridges to build.
And we have a couple of questions pertaining to what separates a cult from a religion?
Well, I would say there's certain common ground there. It depends on what you're talking about. You know, it's, I would say this. when someone is involved in a cultic situation, they start to exhibit certain behavior. All right. Generally, it's maybe their sense of humor goes out the window in a sense. Like things become very serious. So if a religion is causing someone to really act out in accordance to their normal personality, it's the same sort of thing of when you think they're telling you all about their boyfriend or girlfriend, and you're like, oh, great. And then you go meet them. And when they're with their boyfriend or girlfriend, they act totally different than the person you know. And you're like, what is going on here? That's the type of influence. So whether that's a religion or a group, anything that kind of starts to alter the behavior where you're like, my God, this person's not being the person I know and love, and what's going on here? That's a huge telltale. Anything that's asking you to give your time and money, I'm very suspect. The things that I think are really, really out there to help people are given away. So obviously the aspects of control, and the pressure of raising the stakes of where there's got to be this immediacy to make decisions and that sort of thing, and that if the person who somehow the leader has somehow exhibited these traits that are being considered to be so special or maybe otherworldly, that's always, there's always some charismatic leader that kind of seems to have gotten the golden envelope that kind of has figured it out. That's a telltale, because I think spirituality is not really dogmatic in my opinion. Like this, people have asked me many times whether I've lost my faith in God, and in actual fact, all I prayed for was understanding, and this experience has given me a deeper understanding. So I really got an answer to my prayers, but it wasn't in the way that I thought I was signing it up for. So it's very murky, this idea behind religions, and you have to really go I think, more on a case-by-case basis, because if you look at a lot of the cults, and there's about 10,000 in America today that are active that they track, I'd say pushing 80% of them are Bible-based. So you can't say the Bible's a problem. So it's the way the Bible potentially is being interpreted, and then the way the behavior of the group is operating based on that interpretation. And that's quite often very contradictory to what's in the Bible. But that's the stuff you have to try to separate, because when you're in it, it all feels like it's all combined. And that's why the recovery process is so difficult, because you have to kind of unpack everything. And you learn that it's not black and white, which is the way a cult normally controls you, of like, oh, at any moment you can make a right or wrong decision. Well, the truth is you're going to make a choice, and anything you choose is going to teach you. So is it really black or white? I live in the world of shades of gray. So in that shades of gray, you have to kind of unpack your life and say, well, what were the things that actually, even though I was in the cult, taught me something really valuable? I had great camaraderie. I felt like I'd found my tribe. They were really wonderful. I'm a sports player. I love the team aspect of it. There were great aspects to it. There's a reason you stay, but there's also the abuse, and you have to kind of unpack all of that and make sense of it. And it's a lot.
Thank you for that. And we have a couple of questions on something you touched on, Cecilia, which is the public policy perspective. The fact that history has shown from Jonestown to Nxivm that even if a manipulative group is shut down, there always seem to be plenty of others. So the question about what should be done from a legislative standpoint and educational perspective, and another person also asked about political disinformation, and a member of the class of 96 who's being foisted with a lot of violent online rhetoric in the Philippines from the government there. So what do you think can be done to try to really mitigate the strength of these high control groups?
Again, I think that we require new legislation. I mean, this group Nxivm operated in plain sight for 20 years, and the cult leader Keith Raniere had been accused of sexually assaulting a minor, 12-year-old girl and a 15-year-old girl before Nxivm started. But these groups are so skilled at claiming that kind of information, if anybody were to Google it, was just detractors trying to bring him down. They operate in the shadows, and I think it's all about legislation, which will give people a tool to bring these kinds of groups down. You know, the prosecutor Moira Penza, who you saw in these clips, just mounted a brilliant case. But especially with cults who are well funded, they can hire the best lawyers in the world to, you know, to shoot down the prosecution. But I think, you know, this case was groundbreaking, and I think it's important to educate law students, you know, and university students, and just share information about how these groups actually work, because they're so clever at disguising their motives. And in these cults, whatever they claim to be, whether it's religious or self-help or spiritual, is just a front for trying to gain control over a group of people, and financially and often sexually enslave them. So it just is about bringing this subject out into the light, and it's a scary one. Nobody wants to admit that they might ever be vulnerable, or that anyone they know has been vulnerable. So it's really about having the conversations.
What emotions did the arrests have for both of you? The arrest and the conviction, even
Yeah,
more important.
I mean, to piggyback on what Cecilia just said, it was a groundbreaking case, and it's a precedent that can be built upon in this country. So to actually see people be accountable for their actions has not really happened before. I mean, it's if you look at the history, and certainly in our country in this area, it's painful, and it's absolutely awful. And as Cecilia said, some of these groups are so well funded that even when all the evidence works against them, they can still find a way around it. So to see justice being served, boy, that to me, it was a groundbreaking, wonderful moment that is long overdue.
I think at the same time, you do have some sympathy for the inner circle, who, you know, were so deeply indoctrinated that they were willing to commit acts of abuse on others. But you know, ultimately it's the cult leader. There's usually a narcissistic, psychopathic predator at the top of these organizations, and then he's able to convert his disciples into abusers.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, and so we know what happened with Keith. Well, somebody asked, what happened to the leader of Eternal Values Cult?
He died in 1990 of AIDS, and then this other guy, David Seaman, took over. And as far as I know, I think he's a chiropractor down in Florida somewhere now. So, but the group doesn't exist. I sued them and took them down in, I think it was 2002. So the group has fractured and is gone, but the remnants are still there. And like I said, because of the lack of conversations and any discourse happening, the healing really hasn't taken place. So that's just where that sits at this point.
I will share that one of our questions comes from somebody who's currently taking a college course about cults and the dangers that lie behind groups like these. So we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to the talk to everyone who signed up for this program. And Cecilia and Hoyt, if you have resources, books that you'd like to share with the group, we're very happy to include that. And really, there are a lot of comments coming from our audience, just conveying to you how important it is, Cecilia, that you created this docu-series, and Hoyt, for your work and your candor in sharing your experience. The last question I'm going to ask from the audience, I think you've kind of answered, but I think it's also very important to kind of end on this note, which is a question whether it's cults attract people who are insecure or who have a weak ego structure.
No, that's absolutely incorrect. And again, I come up against that many times because I've had this conversation. I can be at any cocktail party and drop the cult bomb and just casually pass make some comment of, well, I was in a cult for 20 years. People are like, Did you just say you were? And it's a defense mechanism to think there's a certain weakness in someone else, or so that you just feel like it can't happen to me. And that's where that point of view comes from. So, and that's not to say that people who get in cults might not have, might be insecure or have a weak ego, ego structure, whatever the term that they use. So that's not saying that that kind of person can't get involved, but to think that that is the only kind of person that gets involved is incorrect, because it's this mechanism that we all want to just say, well, I say to people all the time, we all kind of have an acceptable list of things we could worry about, like, oh, I could get a terrible illness, or I could have a terrible accident, or or have some hurricane hit me and wipe out my house and my loved ones, and that's all acceptable. But if I said, well, you could also get involved in a really toxic cult relationship and have your life taken over and give away your money, like, even on my short list, like that's not even on my radar. And I'm like, it should be, because it happens, and it happens on some level to all of us. We all get taken on, on these rides. And as long as we think we can't, you're sitting in the exact spot I was when it happened. So I just advise that person to loosen their hold on that perspective, because that's actually setting themselves up for a fall.
Cecilia, any thoughts on that you'd like to share as well?
I'm a filmmaker, so I can talk about how I structured the story and how we told it on camera. I think Hoyt is better qualified to talk about, as a former member. I guess just the one thing I wanted to add is the courage of Catherine Oxenberg in my story, and maybe as a role model for other mothers. She just would not give up. She went to the FBI, she went to the media, she pounded on every door. She didn't stop until the New York Times published a front page article with a picture of the branding on the cover, and then the FBI finally pressed charges, and the cult had really managed to alienate India from her. And they said, your mother just wants attention and she's trying to bring us down and she's jealous of you. But the one thing India said was that those messages that kept coming from her mom, even when they hadn't spoken for a year, I miss you or Merry Christmas, those are the things that stayed with her, and that helped her eventually to leave and to believe that her mother would still love her and there would be another life for her. So I guess, my thought is that if you do know somebody who's in a cultic relationship, don't give up. Even if you think they're not listening or not taking it in, chances are that might be the one thing they'll remember.
Thank you. That's a really, really important note. So I'm very glad that you shared that. And I really want to thank you, Cecilia and Hoyt, for joining us to share your very powerful, very honest and compelling insights about cults and coercive control, and to give us an inside view, Cecilia, into your hit series Seduced inside the Nxivm Cult. And I also want to thank the Princeton Club of New York, Princeton Arts Alumni, Princeton Club of Southern California, and Princeton and Hollywood for co-sponsoring this program. And a very big thank you to all of you who joined us this evening for this important program. As I said, the Princeton Club is recording the talk, and we will send everyone the link. And we hope you'll join us for our other terrific programs that we have coming up, including a 3-part sustainability series that I'll be hosting that kicks off on April 15th. And we're very glad to bring you these thought-provoking programs that you can enjoy from the comfort of your living room. Cecilia, we wish you tremendous luck with the Emmys. And we would love to have you both back to discuss your new projects when they're ready. I wish we'd had more time to talk about those new projects, but you have a very open invitation to come back and share them with us as you go forward. So thank you again, Cecilia and Hoyt, and everyone in our audience for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Princeton Club of New York.
Thank you so much.